Coming up, I'm going to be less generous in my comments regarding the mayor. I suspect that this is another instance of members of the more elevated classes looking down upon the needs, beliefs, and traditions of those outside those elevated classes, except for those who they've chosen to align with for political reasons. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? One of the themes of Political Spirits over many episodes has been to point out the divides within our country with a particular focus on the failure of much of the political class, academia, and the media to understand rural America. Much of what has been derisively referred to as flyover country, and the blue-collar traditionalists who together form a large portion of President Trump's base, and I include within that base practicing Christians. For this segment, I'm going to combine that theme with something that I've observed over the years, and each time I do so, I'm still shocked and always disappointed that it still exists. And that is the ability of persons in power, from low-level bureaucrats to those possessing extraordinary powers, to make decisions, take actions, and make pronouncements that are absolutely devoid of logic, and so obviously wrong that anyone should have understood that from the get-go. But somehow, they didn't. Sometimes those persons in power get smacked down by the regulators put in place to oversee them, the courts, for example. Sometimes it's the electorate. But every time it happens, I'm left wondering how on earth those persons didn't see it coming. Most troubling is the situation where I believe they knew, but didn't care. So what instance of extraordinary stupidity by a person in power am I talking about? I'm talking about the mayor of Louisville, Kentucky, and his decision to ban religious services even if they take place in parking lots where the congregants stay in their cars. Incidentally, the mayor issued his decree less than 1 week before Easter Sunday, noting that, quote, it's not really practical or safe to accommodate drive-up services taking place in our community, close quote. Oh, really? While the mayor was prohibiting religious gatherings where people stay in their cars in the parking lot and the pastor is outside at the head of the parking lot full of cars using a speaker, or the congregants listen to the pastor over the radio, drive-through restaurants and drive-through liquor stores were allowed to remain open. Got that? In Louisville, under the mayor's decree, it was considered unsafe and therefore impermissible to sit in your car and listen to a sermon given by a preacher at the head of the parking lot, but it's considered safe to drive up to a liquor store and conduct an exchange of money for alcohol. And it goes even further than that. I don't want to pick on alcohol, especially given that the name of this podcast is Political Spirits, and spirits refers to alcohol. But because liquor stores are considered an essential service, you can park your car and walk into a liquor store in Louisville. But under the mayor's order, you couldn't park in a church parking lot, stay in your car, and listen to a sermon from the minister on the radio. But there's more. In Louisville, there's nothing prohibiting sitting in your car in a parking lot for no reason at all. But the mayor prohibited sitting in your car in a parking lot listening to a pastor's sermon. Put it all together, and this qualifies as one of those absurdly stupid decisions by a person in power that just leaves you shaking your head. So how has this ended up? Today is Easter Sunday. Are churches in Louisville that want to have gatherings for Easter by having congregants sit in their cars going to be fined, arrested, reported to health authorities? Well, no. But not because the mayor issued a correction of his prior statements. They're not going to be prohibited from worshiping in their cars in parking lots because one of the churches filed for a temporary restraining order in the federal district court. And the judge issued one of the most blistering opinions I've ever seen and granted the restraining order. The memorandum opinion opens with the following 5 sentences that together constitute perhaps the most brutal takedown from the bench you'll ever see. Quote, "On Holy Thursday, an American mayor criminalized the communal celebration of Easter. That sentence is one that this court never expected to see outside the pages of a dystopian novel or perhaps the pages of The Onion. But 2 days ago, citing the need for social distancing during the current pandemic, Louisville's Mayor Greg Fisher ordered Christians not to attend Sunday services even if they remained in their cars to worship, and even though it's Easter. The mayor's decision is stunning. And it is, beyond all reason, unconstitutional." Close quote. I'm not going to burden you with a whole opinion, but I encourage you to read it all. It's not long. The case is On Fire Christian Center, Inc. versus Greg Fisher et al. It is short but sweet and definitely well written. I love the fact that the judge set out the history of the Pilgrim's journey to the New World and that their search for freedom to practice their religion helped form the foundation for the guarantee of religious liberty in the Constitution. And he noted that, quote, "Although their notions of tolerance left more than a little to be desired, the Pilgrims understood at least this much. No place, not even the unknown, is worse than any place whose state forbids the exercise of your sincerely held religious beliefs." Close quote. The temporary restraining order was, of course, limited in application to the On Fire Church, but the judge cautioned the mayor not to take that as a license to engage in such violative behavior with other churches wishing to engage in drive-up services. In the end, the court enjoined Louisville from, quote, "enforcing, attempting to enforce, threatening to enforce, or otherwise requiring compliance with any prohibition on drive-in church services at On Fire." Close quote. Well done, Judge Justin Walker, and get a clue, Mayor Greg Fisher. Incidentally, the mayor now claims he never prohibited drive-up church services. Try to square that with his quotes referenced in the court's memorandum opinion. So how exactly does such a poorly reasoned position as that taken by the mayor get adopted? Well, it's sad to say, but I suspect it's because the mayor either doesn't understand worshipers who would choose to sit in a parking lot to listen to a sermon, or doesn't appreciate them, or, this would be the most unfortunate if true, doesn't really care about them because he doesn't see them ever voting for him. He may see them simply as deplorable. Can I show that? No. Do I know that's how he sees them? No. The judge took great care to note the difficult circumstances the mayor was facing given the pandemic, and to note that his decision in no way indicated that the mayor was motivated by anything other than a desire to protect the populace. I'm going to be less generous in my comments regarding the mayor. I suspect that this is another instance of members of the more elevated classes looking down upon the needs, beliefs, and traditions of those outside those elevated classes, except for those who they've chosen to align with for political reasons. I'm not a citizen of Louisville, so I won't have the opportunity to vote in the next mayoral election in that fine city. As a side note, I should mention that I received a job offer in Louisville right out of grad school, so I could have ended up there. It's a very nice town with an incredibly low cost of living. But in the end, I chose to come to Florida. If I were a citizen of Louisville, I'd have serious questions about the judgment of this mayor, and I really can't imagine ever voting for him. Next topic. Put yourself in the other guy's cowboy boots. As most of us remain holed up in our houses awaiting the decision by government to start to lift the various lockdowns in place around the country because of the pandemic, I know that I and many of my friends are focusing on endless amounts of coverage online and on television. Whether it be the presidential press conferences or New York Governor Cuomo's press conferences, or the seemingly endless stream of talking heads on cable news announcing that the U.S. now has more coronavirus cases than any other country, and presenting an endless stream of discussions about how bad this can be and how long the restrictions must continue, the one thing that's apparent is that, in typical fashion, the focus is on the deaths, the spread of infection, the hot spots. There's very little talk about the extreme differences between different parts of the country, other than in the context of focusing on where the hotspots exist. It was in that context that I came across the complaints from some in the media about the purported less than effective practicing of social distancing and failure to impose a lockdown in the state of Wyoming. Following on the theme of the first segment, this looks like another example of the elevated classes, in this case the media, just not understanding much of the country on which they're supposed to report. I know I wasn't the first to have this reaction, but the moment I heard criticism of Wyoming for not sufficiently practicing social distancing, my reaction was, isn't living in Wyoming the very definition of social distancing? After all, we're talking about one of the largest states in the country in terms of land mass, but which has the lowest population with just 577,000 citizens. Think about that. It's the 10th largest state in terms of square miles, nearly 100,000 square miles in fact, but it has less than 30% of the population of Broward County, Florida, where I live. As Wyoming Senator John Barrasso pointed out, Wyoming has only about 5 people per square mile. In his words, quote, "We've been socially distancing the entire 130 years that we've been a state," close quote. Now compare that to New York City, where COVID-19 really presents the greatest threat, the city which is clearly the coronavirus hotspot. The population density in New York City is 26,403 people per square mile. In Manhattan, it's 66,940 people per square mile. Now, with that in mind, consider the argument that some have made that President Trump is not showing leadership because he's leaving too much to the governors of the various states. My reaction to that criticism is that it ignores the fact that we are a federalist system. We are the United States of America. Having the federal government set out the guidelines for the states to follow, but leaving the specifics to the states so that there can be individual variations, shows not a lack of leadership, but rather recognition of the nature of our system of government and expressing leadership while maintaining that system. In fact, if you look at the statements of those who've criticized President Trump's decisions in that respect and who would have pushed for a more complete centralized control, including actually taking over private companies as opposed to directing them to produce certain critical products or prohibiting them from exporting those critical supplies, you have to wonder about the future of our country if those politicians gain control. They're far too eager to build an all-powerful centralized federal government. And anyone who believes in the benefits of government at the state level should be deeply concerned about what would happen if anything close to a pandemic occurs again with those politicians in control, virtually every one of which is a Democrat. Think about what they'd try. Think about the companies they'd try to take over and place under the control of the federal government. Look at what we accomplished in World War II. Look at what Ford Motor Company accomplished at its Willow Run plant. It produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. The federal government didn't take over Ford. It directed Ford to produce B-24s, and it did so at a pace far beyond anyone's expectation. The Willow Run plant, perhaps more than any other facility run in any of the Allied countries, embodied the phrase arsenal of democracy, which became so associated with the United States of America. And that arsenal was produced by private enterprise, not by government entities. To assume, even to believe, that the way to produce large volumes of well-made products to respond in the event of a nationwide emergency is to have the government itself produce those products is to ignore America's history. To reject allowing the individual states to adopt lockdowns and social distancing based on the individual characteristics of their state, but within the framework of guidance provided by the federal government, is to ignore the nature of our government and the history of its establishment under the Constitution. And such a rejection would also ignore the very nature of our states. There are parts of this country where the nearest police officer is 50 miles or more away, where you have to drive 30 miles to a grocery store. Every day, somewhere on the media landscape of television or the internet, we find celebrations of diversity, but only the diversity chosen by the media and academia as worthy of celebration. It's time we recognize that our diversity has many more layers than that, and various states with all their idiosyncrasies represent many of those layers. Living in Wyoming is indeed the definition of social distancing. And as we look at the wise choice of President Trump to leave much of the specific local decision-making to the states, we should recognize that just as we should be prepared to walk a mile in the wingtip Skechers or Nikes of residents in New York to appreciate their needs and what they're going through, we should also be prepared to walk a mile in the cowboy boots of a rancher in Wyoming. Which leads me to my next topic. Where do we go from here? We have to open the country up. We cannot remain on lockdown forever. There are definitely signs that the virus is peaking in the U.S., and has peaked in some U.S. locations already. While I have no doubt that the social distancing directions and lockdowns have reduced the spread of the virus and the death count, I also believe that much of the reduction below the predicted hospitalizations and, to a lesser extent, death count were the result of predictions being flawed from the get-go. They were just too high. Moreover, there is reason to believe that the numbers of deaths that we are seeing are inflated because of deaths attributed to COVID-19 based on suspicion with no test result and designated COVID-19 as the cause of death rather than other pre-existing conditions. Why have deaths from ordinary flu dropped almost to zero? The obvious implication is that without actually testing for COVID-19, cause of death is being listed as COVID-19 when ordinary flu symptoms are present, even though to a significant extent symptoms overlap. Why have deaths from pneumonia dropped almost to zero? The obvious implication is that nearly all pneumonia deaths are being attributed to COVID-19. Keep in mind that in 2018, nearly 60,000 Americans died from either influenza or pneumonia. The numbers are far from insignificant. Does this mean that COVID-19 is a hoax? No, of course not. But it does mean that it hasn't turned out to be as catastrophic in the U.S. as many had predicted. Some significant portion of that reduction, perhaps even the vast majority of that reduction, is because of the protective steps taken. But regardless, surely we have reached the point where we can relax at least some of the restrictions. And how do we do that? We do it in a way that recognizes the diversity of our country, not racial diversity, not political diversity, but rather the diverse impact of this virus on different geographic regions of the country and the diverse population density of the country. New York is going to be on lockdown for quite a while, but there's no reason that we can't start opening up rural areas, businesses in areas that are not in hotspots, and gathering places provided spacing restrictions are implemented, and stores beyond those that provide critical goods and services, so long as social distancing steps are taken. We celebrate the diversity of America almost every day. It's time we recognize the extent of its diversity and open up our economy with a diverse set of relaxed restrictions that recognizes the differences in population density and other factors across our country, as well as steps which can be taken within places of employment, such as wearing masks and rubber gloves and prohibiting large in-person conferences. I expect that will start soon, perhaps as early as the end of April in some states. And I expect the media to go crazy, labeling Republican governors and President Trump as having blood on their hands. And as so many of us have done for years, we're going to have to ignore the wailing of the media and go on with our lives under less restrictive rules, which will almost certainly take effect at different times around the country. I can't wait for that day to come. And hopefully you can't wait for the next episode of Political Spirits. Be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube also, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.